Color guard advance. Down salute. Post the colors. Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Color guard dismissed. Everyone, please be seated.
Oh, thank you. Before I welcome everybody today, I would just like to thank Nancy Holm and her son and another member of the Troop 400 for, and her husband for helping with Color Guard. That's a tradition we have every year, and Joe Sauer, who used to be the head of Troop 400, started with us with it many, many years ago. So thank you to Nyama, who's sitting right here, Nyama Reed, and for hosting us today, who's very gracious and supportive of the UN and Whitefish Bay Library. We have the UN flag hanging outside at the library and at the City Hall and Whitefish Bay High School. And we're thrilled to have this lovely banner that Nyama made for us. So I'd like to welcome our live audience today for making effort to come out on such a beautiful day to honor this 77th anniversary of the UN. And I'd like to welcome the friends on Zoom. I'm going to call them the actors on Zoom in our live audience. So I'm pretending that we're like in Hollywood. So this is the 77th year, signed and ratified in San Francisco, California, in 1945 by many distinguished diplomats, including one of my heroines, Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'm sorry to say I'm reading some of this because I'm so nervous that I just wanted to get it right. I'd like to acknowledge a few friends in particular today, because as a retired MPS teacher and as a great advocate for youth, and happy to say there is a member of Model UN Whitefish Bay sitting with us today, and the advisor, Mr. Habercorn, is also with us today. So we're very happy they're with us because in part they're responsible for helping to lead this program every year. So supporting youth, I'd like to acknowledge a few people today that are here, a few friends. Just a minute, please. First one, I did acknowledge an MUN Whitefish Bay member, but then the next oldest is a young woman in her late 20s, and her name is Alexis Laverdiere, and she is representing our mayor today, and is also a dear friend of mine. And I asked her to write a little something up about what she does, because in her work she reflects very much the sustainability goals of the UN currently today. And the UN is doing things internationally, but she is doing things locally that are really making a difference. And she works 24/7 on these things and is very passionate. She is the City of Milwaukee Environmental Collaboration Office Sustainability Program Coordinator. Specifically, she oversees the marketing and the water-centric city initiative. Her work addresses the goal of clean water and sanitation. She works closely with Milwaukee Waterworks, MMSD, that's the sewage department, and nonprofits to advance initiatives to improve our waterways and support clean drinking water. She's the staff of Mayor Johnson as a co-chair of the Mayor's Commission on Water Equity for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. At the U.S. Water Alliance's National One Water Summit in Milwaukee this September, she organized a field hearing with mayors from Great Lakes states to express how to improve water equity to representatives of the EPA. Mayor Johnson spoke specifically about lead lateral removal in Milwaukee and how the federal government can better support this work. So please give her a round of applause. If anybody needs water, it's in the kitchen. The next person I would like to acknowledge is Joe Cirincione, who is today here on Zoom. He's the former president of Plowshares. He's visited Milwaukee several times where he's spoken to Milwaukee Rotary and has had discussions with my mother and me over tea, talking about youth engagement and bringing youth into Plowshares projects. And I know he's passionate about youth. So we're glad you're here with us. He's a proverbial youth himself. Somebody else I'd like to introduce on Zoom is Sheldon Lubar, who spoke at our 75th UN celebration, engaging Model UN students of Whitefish Bay High as they shared a riveting panel discussion. Then he gave each Model UN officer a few days later a copy of his book. He has been a great philanthropist in Milwaukee and has given much to UWM and the Whitefish Bay High School and community. And he is a very, very dear friend of ours and very concerned about this subject that's being spoken about today. And lastly, the most youthful person I know, who started this celebration 18 years ago, who was the brainchild and development leader of UNCIL, United Nations Schools of International Learning, now in 15 Milwaukee public middle schools, serving 2,000 students. My greatest inspiration, and 106 years young, Joan Robertson, my mother. So now that I've taken up several minutes of our time, I wanted to say that I was just desperately trying to figure out how to introduce Dr. Helfand. And honestly, I have to say I've fallen asleep in some introductions in the past. So I didn't want to have to give that to you because you can read about him. You can Google him. There's so much about him. But when I met him and I found him so engaging and warm, I wanted to ask him here again about youth, about following again with this stream of the thought of youth and engaging youth. So I asked him before we started, if he would mind, instead of an introduction, recounting a boyhood story in lieu of that. And so all of us, and I know many of you and most of you, have youth at the forefront. No matter what race or creed they are, where they are in the world, we all want to support and help youth to be educated and to promote them to become great humanitarians like Ira Helfand. Now I'm going to give you the mic.
Yes, so if you'll just put that on.
Great, thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
So I have a very soft voice. If I drop down and you have trouble, please wait so I know. The invitation to sort of tell stories from my childhood was actually fits quite nicely with one of the key themes that I want to be striking today, which is the urgent need to get young people to learn for the first time about the danger of nuclear war, and actually for us older folks, speaking for most of the people in the room, to re-educate ourselves about the danger of nuclear war. Because one of the really salient features of the current situation is this disconnect. We are on the brink of a nuclear war, and most of the world is not paying attention to that. The story that came to mind relates to the anniversary, which you're also observing this week, the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in junior high school during that event, and there were many moments that were quite frightening and quite dramatic. But one thing that I remember in particular was that a certain day, 7 or 8 days into the crisis, I don't remember exactly when, I was at school, junior high school, we would go out on the playground at lunchtime waiting to come in for afternoon classes. And word went around the playground that somebody had heard on the news that the US had either sunk or intercepted a Russian ship. And we all knew this was, if it were true, was going to be a very serious escalation of the crisis. It turned out it wasn't true, but we didn't know that at the time. We went into class, and everybody was just sort of sitting there, ashen and shaken. And my homeroom teacher, who was trying to do the right thing, stood up and said, "Class, don't worry about this. I've lived through 2 of these, and everything's going to be all right." And there was and then everybody realized she was talking about 2 world wars, and the whole class burst into tears. We were terrified. And that terror, as bad as it was, as unhelpful as it was, it served us well. Because many people from that generation, represented here in this room, and in other gatherings that I've spoken to, we got it then. That nuclear weapons were not something we could ignore, that they were a real threat to us. It's kind of hard to hold that in mind because this threat is not present in our everyday life. Some of the other problems we deal with, inflation, crime, these things that we see visibly every day. The nuclear threat, fortunately, since Nagasaki, has been something of a theoretical threat, in that it's not acting out in our lives on a daily basis. But it's there, and it's enormous, and it's existential. And we need to figure out how to make ourselves understand that. So I want to talk a little bit today about why the danger of nuclear war is so great, what's happened. And then I want to talk about what's going to happen if we have a nuclear war. But mainly I want to talk about what we can do about this. So let me move through those first 2 points relatively quickly if I can. When the Cold War ended, we all started to act as though the danger of nuclear war had gone away. I mean, literally, I remember myself in the fall of 1989 going through my files about nuclear weapons. I've been an activist on this issue at that point for about 10 years, and throwing stuff out because I was making room because I didn't think we're going to need to worry about this anymore. But I remember saving a few things so I could show my young children what I'd been working on for the last 10 years, during which I had missed a lot of very important milestones. I wanted to explain to them that it was for good reason. But I really thought that the problem had gone away. We didn't have to worry about this anymore. And we all started acting that way. The danger never went away. The weapons never went away. The numbers came down somewhat. We used to have 60,000 warheads in the world. Now we have about 12 to 13,000. By some measure, that's an improvement, but by the most important measure, it's not, because as we know, those weapons are still enough to destroy the whole world anyway. So whether you can destroy the world 5 times or you can destroy it 50 times is really irrelevant. But we all acted as though the problem had gone away. And indeed, for a period of time in the 90s and the early 2000s, the world probably was somewhat safer. The danger of nuclear war, while still present, wasn't as great as it had been during the Cold War. But that has changed dramatically in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. The most obvious example of this, of course, is the increased tension between the United States and Russia, which has escalated dramatically since the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. But that situation has been brewing, for a better part of a decade, to the point where people like William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, have warned us repeatedly before Ukraine that we were closer to nuclear war than we'd ever been, even during the Cold War. Another geopolitical flashpoint that could lead to nuclear war is between the United States and China. US-Chinese relations are the worst they've been since the 1970s. There's a specific potential flashpoint over Taiwan, and the danger of US-Chinese rivalry escalating to war, to nuclear war, is real. The situation in North Korea is one that we've paid perhaps the most attention to over the last 4 or 5 years, and with reason. And that situation remains perilous and out of control, as the recent spate of Korean tests have shown. There's also a potential flashpoint that could lead to nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which gets almost no attention here in the United States. But many people believe this is the place where nuclear war is most likely to break out. That was an assessment before Ukraine. But a very, very volatile and dangerous situation. As I will explain a little bit later, a war between India and Pakistan is not a South Asian affair. A war between India and Pakistan will have devastating consequences across the globe, including right here in the United States. So there are these series of geopolitical flashpoints that have gotten much worse over this period of time, and they have contributed to the danger. two other factors that we need to worry about. One is the advancement of cyber technology and the role that plays in the potential for terrorism. We used to think that the worst thing we had to worry about.
I hate to interrupt you. People are having trouble hearing you with that microphone. So if you don't mind switching, like turn off that. And you can keep wearing it if you don't want to.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, if I drop it, let me know.
Yeah.
We used to think that the worst thing we had to worry about with regards to terrorism, a terrorist group could get hold of one or maybe two nuclear weapons. They'd probably be relatively small, and detonate them in a major city and cause terrible destruction. New York or Moscow or Tel Aviv or Bombay, Mumbai, and that's still a possibility. But what we now understand is that there's a much greater danger, which is that terrorists could carry out a cyber attack and hack into the command and control systems of one of the nuclear weapon states, and either directly launch that country's weapons, or perhaps more likely create a false flag, create the fear on the part of the country being hacked, they were under attack, and induce them to launch their weapons in response to this non-existence. That danger is with us, it's growing, it's a nightmare for people in government who are charged with cybersecurity because they know that the aggressor always has the advantage with cyber terrorism, cyber warfare, because the defendant doesn't know what the next attack is going to look like. One final factor that is making this a more dangerous situation, and that is the climate crisis. And we don't often think of the climate crisis and nuclear war in the same sentence, but we need to, because the climate crisis is driving us towards an increased danger of nuclear conflict. The nuclear weapon states, all of them, claim that it is their intention to get rid of their nuclear weapons at some point in the future when the world is safer. The problem is that the climate crisis is making the world more dangerous. And as the climate crisis unfolds over the coming decades, even if we do all the things that we are supposed to do to limit that effect, large portions of the planet are going to find it increasingly difficult to support their populations. There's going to be conflict within countries, between countries. There's going to be mass migration on a scale that dwarfs our imagination. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table as these forces unfold, the chance of nuclear war is going to grow. So for all of these reasons, we have to understand that nuclear weapons pose an immediate and real threat, a real and present danger to our survival. Let's talk a little bit about what happens if the weapons get used. And I want to start by talking about a big nuclear war and what happens in a city that's attacked. Most of us have images in our minds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've seen the pictures. And it is important for us to be aware of them. What happened in Japan in 1945 is an important warning about what nuclear weapons can do. But the main thing that we need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the enormity of the destruction that modern nuclear weapons would cause. In a war between Russia and the United States, it's not going to be one 15 kiloton, 15,000 ton weapon against one or two cities. It's going to be many weapons against many cities, most of which will be anywhere from 15 to 50 times larger than the bombs which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let's look at what happens to a major city. I use often the example of New York, just because it's the biggest US city and obviously one of the key targets in the event of a war. New York isn't going to get hit with one Hiroshima bomb. It's going to get hit with probably at least 15 to 20 weapons, each of which will be on the scale that I mentioned, anywhere from 10 to 15 to 30 or 40 times bigger than Hiroshima. To describe what will happen, I use the model of a single 20 megaton, 20 million ton nuclear weapon. Now, we don't have weapons that big anymore. We used to. But this model is a very good descriptor of what happens when many smaller weapons are used. They would actually cause even more damage, because you cause more damage if you set off a bunch of explosions and spread them out more strategically over the area you're trying to destroy. But it's kind of hard to visualize all these bombs going off. And the model of a single large explosion, I think, is easier for us to grasp. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction. 4 miles across. Within that area, temperatures would approach the temperatures on the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, plastic, wood, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperature would rise to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York City, we're talking about something in the order of 10 to 12 to maybe 15 million people, depending on the time of the day. And if this attack were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would occur in every major city in both countries, and if NATO were involved, most of the great cities in Canada and Europe as well. All told, 200, 300, maybe 400 million people dead in the afternoon. But that's only part of the picture, because the fires caused by these nuclear weapons detonating over cities would put about 150 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America, like here in Milwaukee, interior regions of Eurasia, temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the last ice age. And under these conditions, the ecosystems which have evolved since that ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve. A study that was released in August of this year shows that a war between the United States and Russia would kill 3/4 of the human race, something close to 6 billion people in the 2 years following that conflict. But what that same study also showed was it doesn't need to be an all-out war between the United States and Russia to cause a global disaster. Even a limited war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, would have catastrophic worldwide effects. Enough soot will be put into the upper atmosphere to drop temperatures globally, not quite as far as with the US-Russia war, but far enough to trigger a global famine that would kill anywhere from 250 million to 2 billion people, depending on the exact number and size of the weapons used. Now, the death of 2 billion people would not be the extinction of our species, but it would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that the very fragile, complex, intricate technical and economic system that we all depend on to stay alive would survive that kind of a shock either. So this is the danger that we face. And this is not the plot of a great B movie. This is what's out there looming over us every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. But the most important thing for us to understand is that while this is the future that will be, if we don't get rid of these weapons, it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though an asteroid is coming at the planet and there's nothing we can do about it. These are little machines that we have built with our own hands. Most of the warheads are about the size of this podium that I'm standing on, the chairs you're sitting in. We know how to take them apart. We've dismantled tens of thousands of them already. We have just lacked the political will to dismantle the 12 to 13,000 that remain. And that's where we come in. It's where the United Nations comes in. Internationally, a treaty was negotiated at the UN in the summer of 2017, calling for the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The vote at the UN was 122 to 1. So far, 66, I believe, countries have signed and ratified the treaty, making it legally binding on them. And it is now a formal part of international law. Most of the countries which signed this treaty, all of the countries which signed this treaty are non-nuclear weapon states. The countries which actually have the weapons boycotted this process and actually tried to demonize it and derail it. But the rest of the world stood firm and said they are no longer willing to be blackmailed by the behavior of the 9 rogue nations which have nuclear weapons. They're not willing to let their children be held hostage any longer by the people who control these weapons. And that has changed the international conversation. It has put pressure on the nuclear weapon states to reconsider. But this international effort is not enough alone. We need to build a movement here in the United States and where possible in the other nuclear armed countries to force our governments to accede to the terms of this treaty. And here in the United States, we have launched something called the Back from the Brink campaign. It grew directly out of our involvement in the effort to secure the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it calls on the United States to embrace that treaty by convening negotiations involving all 9 of the nuclear weapon states to secure an enforceable, verifiable, universal, time-bound agreement to eliminate their weapons. It also calls on the United States to take some other intermediate steps to lessen the danger of nuclear war while these negotiations proceed, and to give momentum to the process. We call on the US to announce that it will never use nuclear weapons first. We call on the United States to end the situation where the president has sole authority. The president of the United States can launch nuclear war that destroys the planet without anybody else being able to intervene in that decision-making process. It calls on the United States to take our weapons off air trigger alert so they cannot be launched by an impulsive decision or a cyber attack. And it calls on the United States to abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion, possibly more, over the next 30 years, modernizing and enhancing every element of our nuclear arsenal, and planning to maintain these weapons in the indefinite future. We've modeled this campaign somewhat on the Freeze campaign from the 1980s, which some of you may recall. The idea then was that we would put forward a prescription for what US nuclear policy should be, and get people all around the country to endorse that prescription, and thereby create a national consensus. Back then, the prescription was that the US and the Soviet Union should freeze the arms race, they should stop building new nuclear warheads. Now the prescription is the 5-point plan that I described to you a minute ago. And we have gone to cities and towns all across the country to urge them to adopt specific statements endorsing this platform. So far, I believe it is 65 communities around the country have endorsed, including a number of major cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Tucson, Salt Lake, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, Honolulu. The city of Milwaukee has not yet endorsed, but the county has endorsed the platform. We've also been endorsed by 7 state legislative bodies, the Oregon and California legislatures, and the Maine State Senate, the Rhode Island State Senate, and the New Jersey Assembly. Over 400 NGO organizations around the country have joined this campaign. And we've now introduced a resolution in Congress, in the House, HRES, House Resolution 1185, which embodies this 5-point platform of policy measures that we can take. I think this is the most important and powerful and hopeful vehicle that we have created in this country since the Freeze campaign to bring about profound change in US nuclear policy. And I'm greatly encouraged by the progress it has made, especially over the last year, and believe that if we are determined to get rid of nuclear weapons, we can do it. We can build this campaign. We can create a climate in this country where the United States does take leadership. And if we do launch an effort of this sort, it can succeed. There's no guarantee that it will. We could convince the United States to adopt this policy, and it could reach out to Russia and China and find they're not willing to. That's possible. We don't know it will succeed. We do know what will happen if we don't try. We do know what will happen if we don't get rid of these weapons. And so it's absolutely incumbent upon us to try. But it's also, there's reason to be somewhat hopeful. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US and Soviet Union were literally on the brink of destroying the world, nobody could have imagined that less than 7 months later, Kennedy and Khrushchev would come together to bring about the Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and set up the hotline to try to make sure that we never had a Cuban Missile Crisis again. In 1983, when the United States was positioning nuclear weapons, Pershing missiles in Europe, specifically so we could launch a nuclear war against the Soviet Union, no one could have believed that less than 2 years later, Reagan and Gorbachev would sit down together and say nuclear war can never be won, must never be fought. Even in the midst of this terrible crisis in Ukraine, there are perhaps the seeds of future progress. There's something about what a Canadian diplomat has called these near-death global experiences that can have a sobering effect on our leaders and get them to reconsider the insanely dangerous policies they have been pursuing up until now. But it's going to take us helping them come to that realization. We need to give the push. And so I hope that all of you will use this day, which commemorates the United Nations, to rededicate yourselves to this struggle and will take an active part in it. I would urge you all to encourage the city of Milwaukee, the city of Whitefish Bay, which I believe also has not passed a resolution, to pass resolutions supporting Back from the Brink. I would urge you to approach your congressional delegation and urge them to sign on to HRES 1185. And I would urge you to reach out to that part of the civil society that you belong to, your church group, this UN association, other groups and clubs that you may have an association with, and get them to explicitly join this campaign by endorsing the Back from the Brink platform. We have a terrific website, preventnuclearwar.org. We can get much more information about the campaign, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people might have about it. Let me close with a few general observations. We sometimes think that because it has been so long since nuclear weapons were used in Nagasaki, that somehow or other that's the norm, that they won't be used, that it just can't happen. We have to understand that we are here today not because we have had wise leaders, not because we have had sound military doctrine, not because we have had infallible technology. We are here, as former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara once said, because, quote, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And that's the truth of the matter. We've been unconscionably lucky. We have no reason to expect that we would have had such good luck, and we certainly have no reason to believe that our luck is going to hold forever. If we don't get rid of these weapons, sooner or later, and it may be much sooner than we would like to think, our luck is going to give out. And all of the horrible things that I described to you are going to happen. But it doesn't need to. We are able to direct our own future, and we need to do that. By talking about this with you today, reminding you of the danger that we face, I have placed a very great burden on your shoulders. Because once any one of us knows what is at stake and we can prevent these consequences, there is a responsibility to act. And that responsibility is a burden, there's no question about it. But I hope we can look at it in a somewhat different way. Every one of us wants to do something good with our life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to literally save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. So let's take on this challenge, this burden, in that spirit. Let's commit ourselves to saving the world. And let's create a situation where 2 or 5 or 10 years from now, we can each of us look in the mirror and say that, I helped save the world. What an incredible thing. And we can do that. We sometimes, I think, this is such a huge threat that it's hard for us sometimes to sort of grasp what's at stake here without resorting to some kind of a spiritual, mythological framework. We come from many different spiritual traditions. I'm not a particularly religious person, but in the Hebrew Bible, which I was raised with, it's reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before us today. And so please, let us choose wisely. And let us act with courage and determination so that indeed our children might live. Thank you very much. So I would be happy to take any questions that people might have or entertain any discussion that people might have.
Thank you so much. We're going to just take a 2-minute time for Emma to get the tab for the Q&A and discussion ready. In the meantime, if you want to just...
I think it's very much worth the effort. Mayors for Peace is a terrific international initiative, recognizing the fact that cities are going to be the targets in a nuclear war. Mayors have said it's part of our job to make sure that doesn't happen. It's not just the defense ministry that is responsible for protecting our people. We as mayors are responsible for the safety of our citizens. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe it's over 5,000 mayors worldwide have joined this initiative so far. Here in the United States, Mayors for Peace is working very closely with the Back from the Brink campaign. We're going to cities that are not part of the program yet, asking that the mayor become a mayor for peace and that the city council and the mayor endorse the Back from the Brink platform. And I think this is a way of bringing our national campaign to call for nuclear disarmament, to partner that with a global initiative that has had an enormous impact around the world. It was started by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who continue to provide important leadership to this campaign.
So the people, on Zoom can't hear, so if you can repeat their question real quick, a summary, before you answer. And for those on Zoom who are listening in, you can use the Q&A to send a question, which then I will pass on, so we can get questions from people at home too. Thank you.
The question that I just responded to, as you probably could figure out my answer, is, can I comment about Mayors for Peace? Yes. START Treaty. So the question was, what is the status of the new START Treaty? The new START Treaty was negotiated in 2010 by the Obama administration. It put a cap on the number of strategic nuclear weapons the United States and Russia could have. It was set to expire, and the deadline was right after Biden took office. President Trump did not attempt to renegotiate the treaty, but it was extended in January or February of 2021 for 5 years. That is the only remaining treaty between the United States and Russia that places any legal limits on their nuclear arsenals, and it will expire in 2026. And as part of this general process of negotiating the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, if we haven't superseded the goals of that treaty by then, we need to be sure to extend that treaty again in 2026. It allows each side to have 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads. Now, to be clear, the studies that I was talking about earlier show that as few as 250 strategic nuclear warheads will cause a global famine that kills 2 billion people. So the fact that we're allowed 3,000 worldwide is not a cause of comfort, but it's important that we not go in the wrong direction, start building even more weapons. The treaty allows there to be 1,550 deployed nuclear strategic warheads. Both countries have about 6,000 warheads total, but the majority of them are in storage, not deployed, and many of them are scheduled to be dismantled.
Nuclear weapons.
The question was, the comment was that it's understood that this process of dismantling nuclear warheads has been put on as we pursue this $1.7 trillion plan to enhance our nuclear arsenal. And that's exactly correct. The focus now is on creating more plutonium pits, which are the triggers for hydrogen bombs, and spending our time and energy building new nuclear weapons that are better, more efficient, and more deadly. Yes, please. The question was about the size of the current nuclear arsenal. There are currently between 12 and 13,000 nuclear weapons altogether in the world, 12 to 13,000. The US has about 5,000 plus, the Russians have about 6,000, and then the other nuclear armed states, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, have the remaining weapons. Yes, please. Charlie, the question was to clarify what is what are the 5 points in the back from the Brinkman platform. The first and most important is that we call on the United States to enter now into negotiations with all 8 of the other nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to dismantle the remaining weapons. And then the 4 intermediate steps that we propose are: 1, that the United States announce a policy that it will never use nuclear weapons first. 2, that we change the situation here in the United States whereby there is no check on the president's authority to launch nuclear war. 3, that we take the weapons that we have off of hair trigger alert. Hundreds of the weapons that we have are sitting on missiles that could be launched in 15 minutes, that we end that situation so that they cannot be launched quickly. And finally, that we abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to enhance and modernize every aspect of our nuclear arsenal. Yes, if you go to the website of the campaign, which is easy to remember, it's preventnuclearwar.org. If you go to that website, there's a description of each of those planks in the platform of why we advocate for them, and also a listing of all the communities and so on that have already joined this campaign, and a lot of other resources. Yes.
So I had a quick question. So as sort of a typical person, you know, who I'm not a senator, I'm not connected to senators, how does someone who's watching this later or here in person impact or advocate for the U.S. to adopt back to the brink? Is that letters and phone calls to your state representatives, your state house members in D.C.? What is your recommendation for that grassroots effort to support this?
The question was, how does an individual interact with this Back to the Brink campaign? Mm-hmm. There are many different ways that you can do this. Mm-hmm. We designed this as a campaign that was based in communities rather than individual action. So the way that we mainly advocate is for you to get together with other people in your community to approach your local government and your representatives in Congress and get them to adopt a resolution. That you also approach the other communities that you belong to, so that if you belong to a faith community, that you get your church or synagogue or mosque to endorse this campaign. If you belong to a Rotary Club, that you get your Rotary Club to endorse, and so on. If you belong to a union, if you belong to a professional association. And if you don't belong to any organization, then just start one. And get together some of your friends who are concerned about this and get them to take action. I mean, for example, the UN Association here, I think, I would hope, will endorse Back from the Brink if they haven't already, and make that an explicit statement. And we've gone to some organizations which their response has been, well, typically we don't do that. We host events, but we don't take positions. And I understand where that hesitation is coming from, but the answer I've been giving is that's not good enough at this point. We are literally on the brink of nuclear war. And if your grandchildren happen to be amongst the survivors of that war, they're not going to accept from you the explanation that, well, my group didn't do that kind of thing. This is really an all hands on deck moment. And we have to understand the urgency of this. I mean, while we're sitting here, things could be bubbling out of control in Ukraine or between India and Pakistan. So, in those ways. There's a question in the back. The question was, what's the minimum number the US could have and still threaten to destroy the world? Excuse me, about 200. I mean, Robert McNamara in the 1960s said, an arsenal of 200 nuclear warheads is more than we need. Why we then build 30,000 is a very interesting question. But 200 warheads would destroy the world, which is not just deterring other countries, that's destroying ourselves. We need to understand these are suicide bombs. Our own weapons, used successfully against an enemy who did not get to launch a single weapon back at us, would destroy the civilization that we all depend on. And I don't think any of us want to think of ourselves as suicide bombers. Is it true that Israel still won't admit it has nuclear weapons? If so, how can they be expected to participate in denuclearization? Israel has a nuclear force probably of about 60 weapons. It does not formally acknowledge this, although everybody in the world knows that they do. And they've gotten close to acknowledging it. I participated at a session in the Israeli parliament in 2013, which was the first time there was ever actually an event in the Israeli parliament about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. And there are members from several different political parties, including the far-right parties which support the program, who are there discussing the nuclear arsenal and so on. I don't know what function it serves Israel to continue to say that they won't acknowledge what they have. And that really doesn't make any difference. Everybody knows they do. And the fact that they don't acknowledge it, I really don't think would be a big obstacle. There are several countries which are going to be tough to convince to give up their nuclear weapons because they believe that their survival is at stake. Israel, Pakistan, North Korea. And we may at this point need to add Russia to that category. The Russians clearly feel that nuclear weapons are essential to the preservation of the Russian Federation. These fears on the part of these countries are things we're going to have to deal with in these negotiations. They are wrong to feel that nuclear weapons make them safe, but they do have, in some cases, legitimate security concerns. And we're going to have to figure out how to address them. That's going to be the hardest part of the negotiating process. Interestingly, when I was at that meeting in Israel, I was kind of informally, I was making a presentation. A member of the Likud party, who was a big proponent of the Israeli nuclear program, was there. He had come basically to tell me that I was an idiot, that I didn't understand the realities of the world and so on. I gave him a talk very similar to what I've just shared, information I've just shared with you today. And at the end of it, he came up to me and publicly in front of a very hostile audience said, I cannot agree with you that we need to get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, but maybe we do need to get rid of most of them. And I thought that was a pretty astonishing, concession for him to make in this kind of a setting. And it gave me hope that when we help the leaders of these countries understand what these weapons are going to do, we can make real progress. And that's an important point because we all kind of assume that the people who are control all the weapons, know what's going to happen if they use them? They don't. And we found this over and over and over again. Ronald Reagan, 3 years into his presidency, thought that he could call back a nuclear missile after he launched it. This person in the Israeli parliament had no idea about the climate effects that nuclear weapons cause. When I met with people in the US State Department in 2014, 2 or 3 years after these studies about nuclear famine from limited nuclear war had been published, they were unaware of this information. It's as if you went to a doctor who was prescribing medicines to you without knowing what the medicines were going to do. But the hopeful side of that is, it's very frightening to me that people are functioning at this level of ignorance, but the hopeful side is that when we can teach them what's going to happen, we get a different result. And one of the things I should say is that at some level, some of the people clearly do know what's going to happen. But there's a real difference between knowing something and really knowing it. I know that we can have a nuclear war any day if we don't get rid of these weapons. I don't believe that. I go about my life as though this can't happen. And I think that's part of what's happening at the leadership level. Some part of their brain knows how dangerous the situation is, but we're all pretty good at compartmentalizing, and they just push that out of mind and go about their day-to-day business building more nuclear weapons as though the danger didn't exist. And so if we can get through to them, teach them if they actually don't know, make them confront the knowledge if they have it, I think we can get a different result. And we've seen this a lot with people who leave government. There's a whole long list of former defense officials who were big-time hawks while they were in office, who now say nuclear weapons must be eliminated. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry, some of the key architects of our nuclear program, are now, all of them, well, Secretary Shultz unfortunately passed away last year, but passionate advocates of the elimination of these weapons. Because now they get it. They don't compartmentalize the way they used to when they were still working in government. I'm going to first point in the back and then I'll come forward. Yep. I think fear is. I think it's very important. Fear has a bad rap. We're always told we shouldn't be afraid. Fear is an important emotion. It's what protects us from real dangers. We're afraid of falling off buildings, so we don't the edge. We're afraid of getting burned, so we don't put our hands into a fire. I think people need to, when there's a real danger, people ought to be afraid of it. We have to harness the fear. We can't be overwhelmed by it. And at times in the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, there were people who were just immobilized by their fear of nuclear war. That's not the problem today. The problem today is that the vast majority of people aren't thinking about this and aren't afraid enough. They don't understand. They're afraid of inflation, which is bad, but it's not the end of the world. And so part of our job at this point is to help people understand, have a healthy fear of nuclear weapons, because that's what's going to motivate them to take action.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about NATO recipient versus taking it? In other words, if NATO makes a military decision, does the United States say, well, we have to go along with it? Because NATO is an organization dragged us into a nuclear conflict at the end of the war.
Well, let me say, first of all, this is not an area of expertise for me at all. The doctor, I talk about medical consequences of nuclear war and the need to get rid of them. Some of the subtleties of NATO policy are not things that I am expert about. My appreciation of the situation, just as an interested observer of things for the last 40 years, is that NATO is the tail, it doesn't wag the dog. The United States is the dominant voice in NATO. And I can't imagine the United States being drawn into something because others in NATO wanted to do it. There is the fact that NATO commits us to take military action if any member of the alliance is attacked. So there's that legal obligation. And in that sense, NATO, we could get dragged into a war through NATO. That's a choice that the US has made, and one that we might perhaps revisit. There's been a lot of discussion about the expansion of NATO to the east after the end of the Cold War. and the role that may have played in creating paranoia in Russia. I think it's important that we understand when we look at NATO expansion, this is not something the United States particularly sought. We went along with it. In some cases, we encouraged it. But for the most part, there was a passionate desire on the part of the countries in Eastern Europe to join NATO because they were afraid that exactly what is happening in Ukraine today would happen to them. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, these countries wanted to be part of NATO because they were afraid of Russia. I think it's a terrible tragedy that we were not able in the 1990s to diffuse that situation by figuring out some way to bring Russia into NATO also. And we could have dissolved the whole thing perhaps. But that's the history that we have to live with.
What role corporations play in building?
The question was, what is the role of corporations in promoting the building of nuclear weapons? I think it's complicated. Certainly the defense contractors they get enormous amounts of money from the government, they make huge profits, and they use those profits to lobby very heavily. It's a real factor. I think we can overstate the influence of the defense contractors in the sense that, well, we have to understand they're going to be a powerful opponent of any effort to get rid of nuclear weapons. The really decisive factor is going to be whether we get people to understand the role that nuclear weapons are playing. The defense contractors are a pretty small sector of the economy. It's obscene that we spend $35 to $70 billion a year on nuclear weapons, but it's a tiny fraction of the overall U.S. budget, and certainly a tiny fraction of the total U.S. economy in a given year. And so there ought to be very powerful economic forces, much more powerful than the defense industry, that don't want to get blown up, that we should be able to mobilize to our side. The problem is that we haven't won, I think, the political battle in terms of getting people to understand how dangerous these weapons are. That the rest of the economy, like the rest of the population, kind of accepts the idea that somehow or other these weapons make us safe. And I think if we're able to win that debate, if you will, in the public mind, if we get people to understand that nuclear weapons do not make us safe, they are the greatest threat to our safety, then I think we're going to be able to overcome the opposition of the military-industrial complex. But on a day-to-day basis, it's a powerful engine with enormous resources behind it that works day and night to get Congress to keep paying for these weapons and buying more of them. You know, the definition of a perfect military system is one which has construction components in all 435 congressional districts, and they've done this very skillfully. They've put contracts out so that you can go to almost any congressional district in the country and find some factory that is making some component where some jobs will be lost. And as we know, the jobs that exist today speak with a much louder voice than the jobs which we could create by using that money to do something else. And so it's a very real concern that we have. Yeah. The question was about the congressional resolution for Back from the Brink. At the moment, there is a House version, H.Res. 1185, introduced by Congressman McGovern and Congressman Blumenauer from Oregon, McGovern from Massachusetts, Blumenauer from Oregon. It has, I believe, 10 co-sponsors altogether at this point. We are in conversation with the offices of several senators, Senator Markey, Senator Warren, Senator Merkley from Oregon, to get a companion resolution introduced in the Senate, but we do not have one yet. So at the moment, the real focus at the congressional level is trying to get additional members of the House to sign on to this resolution. And it was just introduced in June. We're really gearing up. We'd like to get, from 10, we'd like to get between 20 and 30 before this session of Congress ends. We're going to have to reintroduce the resolution again in the new Congress in January. But we'd like to begin that process with solid, 20 to 30 members on board already. And I would commend that as a key activity for people to figure out ways to, in an organized way, reach out to your congressman. In Massachusetts, one representative who I will not name by name, but who I think we're going to get to sign soon, and he's not one of the usual suspects in the sense of being somebody who is frequently associated with peace initiatives. But we have gotten many people in his district to contact him. We've met with him with a delegation that includes community leaders, and we've gotten people in several different faith communities to take this on. And depending on the how sympathetic a member may or may not be, some members may just be able to contact and let them know that this exists. Others, you may need to try to organize a little bit stronger show of support from the community. There's the famous adage that gets quoted all the time by members of Congress: I agree with you, now go out and show me that my constituents will make me do this. So. Yes. So two questions about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. One, given that the U.S. is obliged under Article 6 to negotiate the elimination of its nuclear weapons, is there a way to exert leverage there? And secondly, is the fact that the U.S. stations its nuclear weapons in countries which are not supposed to have them, according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is that a violation of the treaty? Let me talk to that one first. The U.S. and the countries which have these weapons stationed have maintained that it is not a violation. The treaty, as when the treaty meets for its review conferences, it has never called the U.S. out on this. I think it's a violation. I think it's de facto proliferation. We've given 5 other countries nuclear weapons, and we've given to all of NATO, all of members, 35, 40 countries in NATO, essentially a nuclear force. And I think it clearly violates the spirit and probably the letter of the treaty as well. Can the treaty be used to exert pressure? One would think so. I mean, the treaty, in this treaty, which the U.S. has signed and ratified, we explicitly commit ourselves to entering into the negotiations which Max Brink is calling for with the other nuclear armed states for the elimination of their nuclear weapons at the earliest possible date. It's been a joke. For 50 years, there's been no intention of meeting these obligations and no progress to meeting these obligations. The review conference, which meets every 5 years, just completed in August, fails always to really hold the nuclear weapon states to task. There are a lot of speeches given about the failure of the nuclear weapon states to do what they're supposed to do. But in the end, they try to have a consensus document. And consensus document, nuclear weapon states won't be part of the consensus document that calls for them to live up to their obligations. It was suggested during the last conference this August that perhaps we need to be using a different mechanism, which is allowed under the treaty. The treaty can issue a statement by, I don't know if it's 2/3 or 3/4 majority vote. It does not have to be consensus. And so if we get to the next review conference, which because of COVID is a little bit off schedule, will be in 2026. If we get to the next review conference and we have not secured the much more aggressive treaty that I've been talking to you about to actually get rid of all these weapons, there is some thought that perhaps that's the route that civil society in those countries which want to put pressure on the nuclear weapon states should pursue. They should introduce a resolution and try to get it passed by the requisite 2/3 or 3/4 majority as a way of further putting pressure on the nuclear armed states. Yes. It's a potential concern at this point. I'm sorry, the question, thank you. Sorry, the question was, is the Iran-Israel situation also a potential flashpoint like the others that I talked about earlier? It's a potential flashpoint for sure if Iran actually develops nuclear weapons. At this point, Iran has not. And so there's not the prospect of a nuclear war between the two of them. There could be a conventional war that could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons by the Israeli side. And yes, that is also a danger. It's interesting that the Israeli arsenal has existed since at least the late 1960s and has been kind of, as we talked about, has been acknowledged and tacitly accepted by most of the countries in the Middle East. The Iranian arsenal is viewed very differently, and I don't understand fully why, but Egypt, the Gulf states, Turkey, have all indicated that if Iran goes nuclear, they may as well, whereas they have not taken that step in response to the Israeli arsenal. So I think we need to view the development of the Iranian nuclear arsenal as a very dangerous possibility. And unfortunately, the last administration sabotaged the working regime that was in place to keep that from happening. The Iran agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, according to the assessment of US intelligence, Israeli intelligence, NATO intelligence, was working. And the last administration, the Trump administration, just sabotaged that. And we're all going to pay a price for that. Yeah. The question was, are there influencers who have either already endorsed the campaign, Natural Green campaign, or who we should be encouraging to do that? There certainly are a number of very important people who have endorsed it already. Former Defense Secretary William Perry, before his death, former Secretary of State George Shultz. In the faith community, I think perhaps the most prominent person recently was Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, who, if people are not familiar with this, Archbishop Wester's diocese includes the Sandia Lab, the Los Alamos Lab, the Kirtland Air Force Base. It is sort of, in many ways, the heart of the U.S. nuclear enterprise. And it is by far, the nuclear enterprise is by far the largest employer in the diocese. And he issued an extraordinarily powerful statement earlier this year, a pastoral letter, calling for the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. And he has endorsed back from the brink. And is encouraging others in the Catholic hierarchy nationally to join him. There are also the several members of Congress who have endorsed the campaign. And there are about 300 local elected officials. They're all listed on the website. But that is a key strategy, getting additional influencers to adopt this and to advocate for it. And if any of you know people who you can approach, it is a very worthwhile thing to do. Everyone's dream in the anti-nuclear movement is to find our Princess Diana. She played an incredible role in the landmines campaign, bringing this to public attention. And the way the world works is not necessarily people that are expert in the field, but the people who have celebrity that can make a big public difference. So, we would love to find somebody in the entertainment world, world of royalty, whatever, who would champion nuclear disarmament in the same way that she championed the elimination of landmines.
Apropos Princess Diana and wonderful person, to reach youth and adults, I want to ask you if you have connected with youth, with elementary school or high school or even college, with Milwaukee, with curriculum, with Milwaukee or others that would study what you're proposing and what the campaign is about, but in a way that doesn't frighten. I mean, because the ideal is to educate children from small up. I mean, that's easy. I can educate children in UNICEF, for example, but in kindergarten. But to educate them, not be afraid to block it out, but to embrace it, to understand what the implications are early on, because I think many of the adult leaders are those that have blocked it out from early childhood on throughout their life and deflected and never really embraced it.
The question was about outreach to young people. What are we doing and what can we do? It's an incredibly important question. we talked a little bit before about the fact that people aren't paying attention to this issue. There are two categories of people in this regard. There are people at my age who knew all this stuff back in the 80s, who have either forgotten it or actively pushed it out of mind. But then there's like two generations that have come of age since the end of the Cold War who never learned this stuff. And I've had the experience, this was something that Jonathan Schell, author of Fate of the Earth, taught me to do. He had a seminar at Middlebury College in Connecticut, which is a very good liberal arts school, in which he taught kids about nuclear weapons. People signed up for the seminar, they were interested. On the first day, he would put out a piece of paper and have everybody write down the number of nuclear weapons they thought there were in the world. At that point, it was about, I think, 18 or 19,000 when I had this conversation with him. He said, most people put down anywhere between 0 and 100. These are smart college kids at a good school who have chosen to take a course about nuclear weapons they're concerned about. So there's an enormous, simple lack of information. What are we doing about that? Well, first of all, it should be noted that there is an increasing awareness among young people. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, is led by young people. They're not high school anymore because they've gotten older, but they've been working on this for decades. At the meeting in Vienna in June, there were huge numbers of college-age kids, college-age people who were there for that meeting, who were knowledgeable, who were articulate, who were eloquent, and who were energetic. So there is some real progress in that regard, but obviously not enough. I kind of think of this as a PG-13 message. I can't imagine talking to elementary school kids about this stuff. I speak to high school assemblies down to freshmen, and really do not sugarcoat any of the messages. I give a talk pretty similar to what I gave today, and have found that this is okay. Kids are totally able to absorb this. They respond the way you would hope. They're upset, they're concerned, but they basically wonder what we can do about it. And I've spoken at a number of, last year, at several assemblies at high schools. I'm going to be going down to Washington next week to spend a couple of days at Gonzaga High School in DC, teaching classes, individual classes there. We don't have a well-formulated national curriculum. There are many teachers around the country, individual social studies, history teachers, sometimes religion teachers, or ethics teachers, who have developed curriculum modules about this themselves. That would be a wonderful project if somebody could come up with the resources to design a curriculum that could be offered, a curriculum that could be offered to schools across the country.
Could you put some of those resources on your website? Or for something?
Well, that's what I'm saying. That no one.
Could somebody do that?
The question is, could we put some of the resources on the website? The resources tend to be sort of like an individual course that a teacher offers. I mean, it's a reading list,
Yeah.
but there's not much beyond that. You know, there are, on the ICAN website, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, www.ICANW, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. On their website, there are all kinds of resources that are very helpful, a lot of video material, and some short videos, which are useful for reaching young people. And there's some material as well on the preventnuclearwar.org website. The International Committee of the Red Cross has prepared some visual material. But this is a field that we really need to develop more. We also need to get the purveyors of popular culture to do more about this. You know, back in the 80s, there were movies like, has everybody here seen the movie The Day After?
Yeah.
All right, this was like a national event when this was shown. Over 100 million people watched it, and it was a subject of discussion in the press for weeks before and weeks afterwards. We need something like that now. We need to get Hollywood to make a popularized movie, not a documentary, but something that'll show in the theaters, a show on, on HBO or Netflix that helps people understand what we're talking about. And we need to get, what we're getting is like a growing cadre of young people who are concerned about this, who know how to use social media, which I do not know how to use. But we've got there's some terrific people. The International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, my base group, IPPNW.org, has has some young people on it who are producing great social media content. Yeah. Yeah, the International Physician Prevention of Nuclear War did win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And we started in 2006, we launched the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And when I travel, I do bring the Nobel Peace Prize with me because college students in particular, but turns out also grown-ups as well, like getting selfies with the prize. And I have it here if anyone would like to come up. This is Alfred. This is the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. And if anyone wants to come get a picture with it, please feel free. We'll be wrapping up in just a minute.
I think time for one more question.
How did you get involved in all?
I got involved in this very. I'm sorry. The question. Thank you. Thank you for getting that. The question was, how did I get involved in this? I got involved in this a very long time ago when I was an intern. Actually, when I was a medical student, I spent some time on the Navajo reservation at Shiprock, and while I was there, I read a book about nuclear power, and became very concerned about nuclear power as a public health threat. And when I moved back to Boston to start my internship in 1977, I met up with a pediatrician many of you may have heard of, Dr. Helen Caldecott, and together with one other doctor, we started an organization called Physicians with Social Responsibility, which was initially about nuclear power and the health effects of nuclear power. But about 6 months after, maybe a year after we got started, we met with Dr. Bernard Loud, who had founded the original Physicians for Social Responsibility 15 years earlier. He said, you know, nuclear power is a very important issue, but you really need to worry about nuclear weapons. And he sent us to the library to read the articles that the original group had published in 1962 in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like the leading medical journal in the world, about the medical consequences of nuclear war. And we were quite convinced that he was right, that this was the greater threat and we needed to focus on. We continued to work to oppose nuclear power, but put most of our energy and resources into nuclear weapons. And we approached this as a medical issue. That was our message, that nuclear war is a public health question. This is not a military question primarily. It's not a legal question primarily. This is the greatest threat to public health that's ever existed, and we need to approach it through that lens. And the role that we played is social responsibility, and then IPPNW, the international physicians which grew out of that, was basically to be the medical voice, to teach people what would happen if nuclear weapons are used, and in that way to inform the large growing anti-nuclear movement of that time. And that's pretty much the role that we try to play as well today. Well, thank you all very much for your attention. This is very difficult stuff to talk about and to listen to and to discuss, and I know you all knew that before you came today. It's a beautiful day out, and I'm very grateful that you took some of your time to do this. But I have two requests for you. One is that as you leave here, the first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to start actively forgetting everything that we've talked about. And it's not just the usual forgetting process. It is an active erasure. This is very uncomfortable stuff to think about. And the way the human mind deals with uncomfortable stuff is to push it out of mind. It's an appropriate defense mechanism, but in this particular case, it's a dysfunctional one. Don't forget about this stuff. You have to hold on to this information. You have to put it in that part of your mind that motivates your daily activity. So that's number one. Number two, don't just think about it. Please take action. It is up to us. We have the power, the ability to get rid of nuclear weapons. If we don't, horrible things are going to happen. But we have that power. We can do this. Thanks. Very important.
So thank you so much. Before we adjourn, we have just a few minutes, please. just to let you know, Jack, that Ira is going to Madison and he's going to be speaking to 400 medical students who didn't have to give up the Packer game. I just want to introduce Steve Watrous, who is the president of the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee. And Steve, if you'd like to just acknowledge or say a word or two, that would be great.
It's very brief. My name is Steve Watrous, the United Nations Association. Thanks to mostly Annette and her mother and I have put this on for years and years, as long as I've been part of this group. So thanks to them for keeping on with it. Thanks to them and help from others in our group, we've had really 2 world-class speakers last year and this year addressing our 2 existential crises. That is last year with Michael Mann addressing climate catastrophe and, well, today nuclear catastrophe. They're connected. And I guess just a personal note, probably based on the inspirational talks from Michael Mann last year, I plan to go to COP27 in Egypt, which is where the governments of the world come together to sort of, well, fiddle while the world burns, unless people from the outside can push them to do better. And so, but you don't have to go there to do something. We'd like to meet with the mayor's office here about Mayors for Peace, and even with Ira on hand. And well, that's enough. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, Steve. So lastly, before we say goodbye, and thank you all for coming, for the participation, for the live audience and the Zoom actors. Every time, my mother had a wonderful idea to give a peace award each year. And this year, Mother and I talked about it, and the board supported it, and the UNA Greater Milwaukee membership. And we would like to present this award to Martha Collins. And Martha, would you come up, please? Because you're also giving the award. So I asked Martha to write it just a little bit up. If I could just read a little bit about why we're giving her the award. This is important. I'm not going to ask her to tell the childhood story. Okay. So Martha is an experienced nonprofit leader who has dedicated her career to working for social justice organizations that focus on building power within marginalized communities. Martha demonstrates the ability to persuade organizations to take action and empower leaders from diverse economic, social, and cultural backgrounds to work together for positive change. This summer, Martha was elected as the United Nations Association USA National Council Representative for the Great Lakes region. Also, she is the Advocacy Committee Chair for both the UNA USA and Greater Milwaukee chapters. Martha serves as the board secretary with the Greater Milwaukee chapter and is an active member of the UNA Women's Affinity Group. I'm almost finished. As an equal rights commissioner with the city of Milwaukee, she passed a local resolution for the convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, as we all know, CEDAW, and sits on the planning committee for the city's for CEDAW campaign. Martha is a longtime resident of Milwaukee and the proud mother of Sean and Seth. And I just want to add that Martha is also a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, of which my grandmother helped start in 1915, but couldn't go to The Hague because she was pregnant with my mother. So let's give Martha a round of applause.
I just want to say thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this recognition. I am not giving up watching the Packer game, but I just came off of a golf course because we don't get many days like this here for much longer. And I'm just flattered, completely speechless. I'm working, Steve, on getting the mayor to meet with us to talk about Mayors for Peace. As a commissioner with the Equal Rights Commission here at the city of Milwaukee,
I know how important it is and have been bugging him at least once a week through emails and calls. So more to come on that. And why I asked so many questions about the resolution. As an advocate, someone that knows it takes more than one person, it takes a collection of us, and it takes policy to change some of this stuff. I'm looking forward to meeting with Mayor and with all of you being there. So thank you so much.
So, well, you did thank everybody, but again, thank you so much to you and sharing your story, personal story. And thank you so much, all of you, for coming today because you made it happen. And my mother was on the Zoom to see, and thank you all to those who were on the Zoom today and the great discussion. And now, unfortunately, we have to let him go, or fortunately, to Madison for his next speaking engagement. But he will be speaking on Tuesday here in Milwaukee at Milwaukee Rotary. If you want to come to that luncheon, let me know. And thanks again for doing all you do. I'm greatly inspired, as we all are.